Montana Territory. Late spring of 1879, dust blew sharp through the streets of Red Elk Crossing. And by the time the cowboy rode in, the girl had already been tied to the post for an hour. Leona Vexley's wrists were raw, rope biting into her skin where the townsfolk had bound her to the old hitching post outside the livery. A crude wooden sign hung from a nail above her head, "Unfit for marriage." Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her lips split from the scuffle, and her eyes brown as creek mud after a storm stared straight ahead, unblinking. The townspeople had all gone back to their chores. They always did eventually. Leave a girl up long enough in the sun and she'd stop looking like trouble and start looking like part of the scenery. But not to him. The cowboy came in slow, leading a tired roan with a limp in its front leg. His hat was dusty, his coat worn through at the elbows, and his eyes sharp, pale blue moved right to her like a man spotting something half buried he was not ready to lose. His name was Abram Zevlin. He dismounted without a word, walked up to her with the quiet confidence of someone who did not ask permission. He did not touch her yet. He looked at the sign, then at her face. Her jaw was clenched tight. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer. Abram glanced down at her wrists, then at the livery stable behind her. A few men leaned against the wall, watching now, not laughing, just waiting. Leona spoke, her voice hoarse. "They say I tried to trap a man into marrying me, that I ain't fit for a husband. You do that?" he asked calmly. She looked up at him, something sharp flickering behind her exhaustion. "No," Abram nodded once. He pulled out his knife, cut the ropes at her wrists, and caught her when she stumbled forward. Someone behind them shouted, "Hey now, she's not yours to take." Abram turned, voice even. "She is now." The men tensed. He narrowed his eyes. "I just made her my wife." Leona froze in his arms, staring up at him. "What?" "I said I just married you," he murmured, steadying her on her feet. "Unless you'd rather stay tied up out here for the crows." Her breath hitched, her lips parted. But she nodded. He turned back to the watching men. "Anyone got a problem? Speak now." No one did. He helped her up onto his horse, then swung into the saddle behind her. The roan limped a bit, but carried them out of Red Elk Crossing without pause. They rode for over an hour before either of them spoke again. The silence between them was not awkward. It was weighty, like both of them were too full of things to say and too tired to say them. When they finally stopped beneath a stand of cottonwoods, Abram helped her down. She pulled away just enough to stand on her own. "You did not have to do that," she said, voice low, still rough. He unstrapped a canteen and handed it to her. "I know." "Why did you?" Abram looked at her for a long moment. "Because I hate liars. And I hate cowards more." She drank, water dribbling down her chin. Her hands trembled. "I am not your wife," she said. "You are now," he said. "Unless you want me to take you back." Her eyes flared wide. "No, then it is settled." She sat down beside a fallen log. Her wrists were red and swollen. Without asking, Abram knelt in front of her and unwrapped the bandana from his neck. He dipped it in the water and gently cleaned the blood from her lip. She blinked fast but did not move away. "You got a place to go?" he asked. "No," she said. "My daddy died last fall. The farm's gone. I worked in town a while, until the wrong man told the wrong story." He nodded. "You?" she asked. He sat beside her, legs stretched out. "I took a bullet in the shoulder 2 years ago. Quit cattle drives after that. Been drifting since." Silence again. But this one was softer. He glanced over at her hands. "I can make us camp. You want to rest a while?" She nodded. He built a fire, slow and careful, while she watched. She did not ask questions. He liked that. When he handed her a piece of jerky from his saddlebag, she ate it without complaint. As the sun dipped low, she asked, "Do you always do things like that? Walk in and marry strangers?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "No, then why me?" "I told you," he said. "You looked like someone worth saving." Her throat worked. "Promise me something." "What?" "If we are going to pretend to be married, you treat me like a person, not a burden." Abram stared at her. "Leona, I do not pretend," she blinked. "You mean to stay married?" "I mean to see where it goes." She looked away fast, but her mouth twitched just a little, not quite a smile, but close. That night she slept wrapped in his spare blanket near the fire. He kept watch with his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness. When she stirred, he looked over. "You all right?" he whispered. She nodded. "Good night, Mrs. Zevlin." She was quiet a beat. "Good night, Abram." And in the quiet dark, with nothing but the fire and the stars above, something began, something real, not rushed, not forced. But something neither of them had expected to find when the day began. The next morning came pale and cold, the kind of light that crept slow through the trees and dusted the dew in silver. Abram had slept with his back against a trunk, boots planted firm, his rifle across his lap. When Leona stirred, she sat up quietly, not bothering to smooth her hair or shake the leaves from her skirt. He noticed her watching the fire's last flickers, jaw tight again, though in a different way than the day before. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and didn't speak. Abram stood, stretched his arms once, then crouched to stoke the coals with a pine branch. "You hungry?" she nodded, barely. "Yes." He fried a bit of salt pork in his pan, the smell sharp and steady between them. When he handed her a piece, she accepted it without looking at him. After a few bites, she said, "You got people somewhere?" "No one left," he answered, watching a hawk drift high across the treetops. "I had a brother in Kansas. He was 23 when he took a spill off a mule and didn't get back up." Leona chewed slower. "I'm sorry." He shrugged once. "You?" She shook her head. "Just me now. Mama died birthing my sister, and my sister didn't last past the first freeze. Daddy taught me to read, though. Said I had too much fire to be wasted on ignorance." Abram smiled faintly, not with his mouth, but in the lines that softened near his eyes. "I could cook," she added after a pause. "Clean, mend, patch, tack, I'm not useless." "I didn't think you were." She set the tin cup aside. "I meant I don't want to be just a mouth to feed. You saved me, but I'll carry my share." He nodded. "You will." They rode north for most of the day, following a shallow ridge that cut through the grassland, rising gradually into hills still touched with last winter's bones. Abram kept the reins slack, letting the roan take its time. Leona rode behind him again, arms light around his waist, never lingering too long. By dusk, a wooden homestead came into view, single-room cabin, sagging porch, a small corral with no horse inside. Abram pointed with his chin. "Belonged to a man I knew who didn't come back from the Ruby Valley. He said I could have it if I ever stopped wandering." Leona sat straighter. "You mean to stay here, for now?" They dismounted together. Abram opened the door hinges stiff and stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, thick with the scent of pine boards and thyme. Leona crossed the threshold slowly, her boots scuffing the plank floor. "It's dry, that's something. I'll patch the roof tomorrow." A silence settled between them again, but not empty. Abram set his rifle by the door and took off his coat. She stood near the hearth, warming her hands over the ashes. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked without turning. "I talk enough. Most men I've known either shouted or lied. I don't do either." She glanced back. Her face had softened, but her eyes held something else now, appraisal maybe. "Depth. I'll take the cot," he said. "You can have the bed." She crossed her arms. "You don't have to give me anything. I know." That night she laid down beneath the old quilt, her back to the wall, the lantern between them flickering low. Abram sat near the window, sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes. Her voice broke the quiet. "You believe in marriage." He looked over, blade paused mid-draw. "I believe folks ought to take care of each other." "That's not what I asked." He set the knife aside. "I believe it's more than a preacher's words or a ring. It's what you do after." She didn't reply at first. Then, "I never wanted to belong to someone, but I think I wouldn't mind standing beside someone." Abram's gaze didn't waver. "Then we'll start there." She reached up and blew out the lantern. The dark settled in around them. Outside, coyotes howled somewhere distant, and the night held steady. Neither of them had ever had a beginning like this before, but there it was, sitting quiet between them. Not born of hope. Born of choice. By the third day, the wind shifted north and brought with it the dull smell of thawing earth and something older like pine needles crushed under boot heel. Abram had cleared the porch roof by noon and was working the rust from the hinges on the barn door when Leona stepped outside in her boots, carrying a tin pail. "I found a spring behind the ridge," she said. "Runs clear, cold too." He glanced at her hands, pink from the water. "You go out there alone." "No one followed me," she said. "I've walked farther with less reason." He stood, wiped his hands on his thigh. "Next time, wait, I'll go with you." She set the pail down and folded her arms. "You planning to order me around now?" "No. Just means I wouldn't like finding you gone." She tilted her head, considering that. You always this careful with folks or just me? He didn't answer right away. You woke up tied to a post. That stays with a person. Leona looked past him toward the hills. I don't want it to. Then we'll bury it, but not by pretending it never happened. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. Inside, she swept the hearth, her movements quick and sure. Abram repaired the back fence where elk had broken through sometime the winter before. He worked without glancing toward the house, but he knew she was watching him from the window because he felt the weight of it, not suspicion, but attention, quiet and deliberate. That evening, she brought in a small bundle wrapped in calico. She laid it on the table and opened it carefully. Found this in the barn loft, she said. Quilt squares, half a top already stitched. Abram ran a finger along the edge of the fabric. You sew enough to make something last. He poured water into the kettle. You want a lantern out there? She shook her head. I've got moonlight. He paused with the flint in his hand. It's cold. I've worked colder. He didn't press her. She gathered the squares and stepped outside, and he listened to the sound of her boots on the boards, then the creak as she settled on the porch. A quiet passed long and clean, and when she came in later, her hands were ink-stained from the old logbook she'd found on the shelf behind the table. I read the names in here, she said. There was a woman once. Lived here before the man you knew. She wrote small, tidy letters. Said she missed Virginia, but she loved the way the snow fell quiet here. Most folks don't write about snow, Abram said. Maybe she had no one else to talk to. He poured her a mug of hot water and steeped the last of the dried sage in it. She cradled the tin cup, steam rising past her cheek. You ever miss something you never had? She asked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Sometimes I think I remember things that never happened, like waking up beside someone and knowing they'd been there a long time. She looked down into her cup. I used to dream about a garden. One with beans and summer squash and a clothesline strung between two poplars. I never had that, but I still miss it. He didn't speak, but he reached across the table and set his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. After a while, she said, I don't know how to be someone's wife. I never thought I'd be one. You don't have to be anything but yourself. And if that's not enough, Abram's voice was low, then the world's wrong, not you. She held his gaze then, steady and long, the kind of look that didn't need to ask permission. That night, she hung her dress to dry near the stove, and when she laid down, her back faced him again, but this time, it wasn't distance. It was comfort. In the dark, she said, Do you think we'll make it work? We already are, he said. She said nothing more. But for the first time, her breathing came slow and even, and he knew she'd fallen asleep before the coyotes even started calling. Leona rose early, before the light fully reached over the ridge. The cabin was still, holding the hush of first breath. She pulled on her boots, careful not to wake Abram, and stepped outside. The earth around the homestead was thawing in patches, the frost giving way to soft loam beneath her soles. She moved toward the slope behind the barn, where a stand of willows had taken root near the spring. Kneeling, she pressed her palm to the soil, damp, loose. She could work with it. By the time Abram came out, shrugging into his shirt, she was already carving thin trenches with a flat stone. Her hair was tied back in a rough knot, sleeves rolled past her elbows. You planning to plant a whole acre before breakfast? He asked. She looked up without stopping. No point in waiting, ground's ready. He watched her a moment, then crouched beside her. What are you putting in? Beans, mostly. Some root cuttings I brought from town. They were meant for the boarding house kitchen, but I kept them when things soured. Abram rubbed a hand over his jaw. You think they'll try. She pressed a seed deep. That'll be enough. They worked until the sun cleared the trees. He fetched a bucket from the spring while she covered the last row. When he returned, she stood, brushing dirt from her palms. You ever farm? She asked. I know how to mend fence and keep a mule from kicking a plow loose, he said. Beyond that, I learn fast. She nodded once, then reached for the bucket. Your horse's limp hasn't worsened. He raised an eyebrow. You checking on him? I don't like things hurting if they don't have to be. He held her gaze a second longer than was necessary. Neither do I. Later, while she patched a rip in the curtain with neat, quick stitches, Abram sat near the fire with a strip of rawhide and a scrap of carved wood. His hands moved steady, shaping a loop. What is it? She asked, not looking up. Bridal piece, he said. Tax store in town wanted too much for one, and I figure if we're staying put, I'll need to make more myself. You never said what you did before all this. She tied off the thread, bit it, and tucked the end. I drifted, took what work I could, drove cattle, broke horses, scouted trails. Nothing that kept me long. You ever want something steadier? He paused. I never stayed long enough to want it. She folded the mended curtain and set it aside. So why now? He answered without hesitation. Because I don't want to leave this. Her fingers stilled on the fabric. You mean the land? I mean this, he said. Here, with you. She didn't look away. You don't know me. I know you didn't lie that day in the street. I know you work without being asked. I know you don't flinch easy. He set the wood aside. I know enough. She rose, walked to the hearth, and stirred the ashes. I used to think if I worked hard enough, people would stop looking sideways at me, but nothing I did made a difference. They were wrong, he said. She turned. You sure of that? He stood, slow, and stepped closer. You think I'd have said what I did in front of the whole town if I wasn't? Silence filled the space between them. Then she asked, voice low, would you do it again? I already have, he said. Every day since. She nodded once, then stepped past him to the door. I'm going to walk the line fence, see if anything's come loose. I'll go with you. No, she said gently. Let me do this one alone. He didn't stop her, just watched her go, the door closing with a soft click behind her. Outside, the wind had picked up, but it was clean wind, carrying the scent of thaw and pine. Leona walked the edge of the property with her head high, boots sure on the path. She paused only once at the far fence line, resting a hand on a post. She wasn't afraid of being looked at anymore. Back at the cabin, Abram stepped out onto the porch, hands in his pockets. He didn't call after her, didn't follow. He just stood and waited, because he knew she was coming back. The first rain of the season came quiet, soft as a sigh against the cabin roof. Abram stood barefoot on the porch, sleeves rolled, watching the sky pull gray over the tree line. The soil would drink deep today, good for Leona's garden. He listened to the steady patter and the low groan of the wind threading through the pine. Inside, Leona was bent over the table, fitting quilt squares into a final pattern. Her braid hung over one shoulder, damp at the ends from her walk out to check the fence line earlier that morning. When she heard his boots step back inside, she didn't glance up. You ever think about getting livestock? She asked. I've thought about it, he said, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. Chickens, maybe a cow, mule if we can find one that's not half blind. She slid a square into place. I could sell eggs in town. Trade butter for flour. He leaned against the wall, watching her work. You want to go back there? Not for them, she said, but I don't want to live quiet for the sake of hiding either. If folks see me standing beside you, working this land, they'll learn to keep their mouths shut. Abram nodded slowly. We'd go together. You wouldn't walk back in alone. I know. She pressed one palm over the quilt top, smoothing it flat. I'm thinking we could use one of the back corners for a coop, close enough I can hear if a fox comes around. I'll get the lumber from the old shed north of the ridge, he said. It's falling in, but the planks are sound. She met his eyes across the room. You always this agreeable? No, he said. Just with you. That made her laugh, quiet, rough-edged, but real. The sound filled the cabin in a way that made him want to hear it again. By the third week, the garden had taken root. Shoots lifted through the soil like green fingers testing the air. Abram had cut fence posts from the spruce that grew dense along the creek, and Leona had stitched the finished quilt into a cover for the narrow bed they now shared. She didn't ask, and he didn't suggest they'd simply folded into the space together one night after the fire burned low, her hand resting near his without hesitation. In the afternoons, she read aloud from the old logbook, not the entries, but the notes scribbled in the margins, planting times, weather patterns, remedies for coughs. She marked a few with charcoal, murmuring to herself while Abram carved handles for the tools they'd salvaged. One morning she sat on the porch step, rubbing a cloth over a tin cup until it shone dull and clean. Abram came up from the creek carrying a bundle of stripped bark and a small tin box. I found something, he said, crouching beside her. She tilted her head. What is it? He opened the box. Inside lay a ring, plain brass, scuffed at the edge but whole. Washed up near the bend. She looked from the ring to his face, then back. You want me to wear that? I want you to have it if you want it. She took the ring, held it in her palm a moment, then slid it onto her finger. It fit as though it had always belonged there. I never pictured this, she said softly. What? Peace. He stretched his legs beside hers. Neither did I. The next trip to town came with sky clear and sun high. Abram hitched the roan to the wagon they'd borrowed from a neighbor who'd taken to visiting once word got out that the Zevlins were keeping up the old place. Leona wore her hair tucked under a plain bonnet, not to hide, but to keep the dust off. They rode side by side, her hand resting lightly on his knee when the wagon hit a rut. No one jeered when they stepped off in front of the trading post. The postmaster nodded once. The blacksmith offered a jar of pickled beets for trade. Leona bartered eggs and a spool of thread for a length of oilcloth. No one spoke of old stories. On the ride back, Abram handed her a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, tugging at the twine. Something the tailor had lying around. "Thought it might suit you." She unfolded it to reveal a length of blue calico patterned with white blossoms. "I haven't had a dress that wasn't secondhand since I was 16, she said. "I know." She laid the fabric carefully across her lap, the wind tugging at its edges. "You already gave me a ring. This wasn't a gift," he said. "It's a beginning." They didn't hurry home. The wagon creaked soft beneath them, and the road wound slow through the trees. When the cabin came into view, smoke curling gentle from the chimney, Leona reached for his hand and laced their fingers together. That evening, she sat near the hearth, pinning the calico in place, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Abram swept wood shavings from the floor, then crossed the room to her. "You ever think about building on?" he asked. She looked up. "More space, could be, or just room for what comes next." She set the fabric aside. "What do you see coming next?" He crouched in front of her, hands on her knees. "Whatever you want. I want us to stay," she said, "to plant deeper, to not have to start over again. Then we won't." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "You're the only thing that's ever felt like something I could keep." His hands found hers, warm and certain. "You're already mine, Leona. You always will be." They didn't speak for a long time after that. There was no need. The next spring, a coop stood behind the cabin, chickens pecking along the edge of the garden where beans climbed higher than ever. A mule named Charlie took to Abram like they'd worked together 10 years. The bed had a new frame, built by his hands, and the quilt she'd made covered them both each night. Leona wore the calico dress to the first gathering they attended as husband and wife, no questions asked, no glances sideways. She held her head high, one hand resting on her belly, the other tucked into Abram's palm. They stayed on that land the rest of their lives. Raised crops, raised children, raised each other from the lives they'd had before. And they were happy because they had chosen one another when no one else would, and because neither one ever stopped choosing again, each day, in 100 quiet ways.